Well done.
I'm sorry you have this old.
A bit under that, maybe. Okay. All right. So I wanted to just carry on talking about what started last night. Because last night we ended up with more questions than answers. Tonight we'll end up with even more questions. But we might get one or two answers. And tomorrow we'll talk about something else. But for those who weren't here, I'm just talking about what's been in the news in terms of nothing to do with the war. But in terms of this cultivated meat grown in a lab, and there are different ways that it's made. I meant to mention last night as well, because there are so many different companies doing it in so many different ways and different sources of cells, to ask a question like, is lab-grown meat kosher? It's like saying, is meat kosher? It depends which meat are you talking about, which lab-grown meat, which method. It's important to understand because very soon things are, already some Piskei Halacha have come out. At some point, certifications are going to come out for some of these products, and people can get very easily, confused and misunderstand just because one product may be certified, it doesn't necessarily mean anything about the others, and vice versa. But we're talking specifically about eggs. So last night we were talking about the chicken eggs, right? And the case is again where an egg is turned into meat, not that the chick grows out of the egg, but in a lab, you take cells from an egg, and those are grown and manipulated in a certain way that they grow a piece of muscle as the same appearance, texture, taste, etc. as meat. So when we're dealing with a chicken egg, right, as much as we said last night, it's far more simple because the chicken egg itself, nobody would question, is kosher. Nobody would question that the egg itself is paruv. So it would seem likely, it would seem reasonable, it would seem to follow logically that the egg that starts off as kosher will end up as kosher because you haven't done anything to make it non-kosher. In terms of going from paruv to meaty or not, that's more of a difficult question. But what we saw from the egg is the very fact that the egg in its development starts off as flesh inside the chicken, and at that point it is clearly meat. May not be permitted for consumption either, and it ends up as paruv. So an object can start off in one way, end up as something else. It can start off as meat, end up at paruv, and vice versa. So the question is, what he wants to get to the steak. What happens when we are dealing with a cow? And again, the cells come from an egg. You have a fertilized egg, which is inside an embryo, which is inside the cow. This is the method that's being used. Is one that was perfected in the dairy industry, but the embryos are washed out from the cow, and from those cells, you can call it an embryo, call it a fertilized egg. At that point, it's the same thing. Those stem cells are taken, and from there, a piece of meat is going to be grown, it's going to be constructed. So in the case of the chicken egg, we know that the egg starts off as paruv. It's a separate entity. It's something which we have sources for us. We have a precedent for us. We've been eating eggs for hundreds of thousands of years. Right? Chazal talk about eggs. The Shulchan Aruch talks about eggs. Everybody talks about it. Now we're dealing with something which is very different. We're dealing with a mammalian egg, so to speak. It's not an egg in that sense. In that sense of the term, that it's never going to be an independent entity. You won't be able to see it. You won't have a shell. It won't be it won't be laid in the same way that a chicken egg is laid. It's part of essentially it's just a cell that is part of the animal. So how do we view it? Is it going to be meaty? Is it going to be paruv? Is it going to be kosher? What's it going to be? So about a year ago, I think it was, that Chief Rabbi David Lau went to visit the factory, and he had a look at this process, and he wanted to say that this product is going to be kosher and it's going to be paruv. Now we'll talk very soon about why he said it's kosher, but he made a very important caveat to say that it's paruv. He has a whole long article dealing with it, and he says that there are huge issues of marit ayin, and therefore the only way he would accept that it would actually be paruv is if it was marketed as paruv, meaning they called it a vegetarian product. He said they don't call it meat. He said if you call it meat, then we have to treat it as meat, and we have to treat it as meaty. Most people, most media outlets at least, either forgot to read that part or decided to ignore it. This whole thing came out. The whole world, Chief Rabbi says that meat is paruv. He never said meat is paruv. He said if you're going to treat it as a non-meat, as a meat substitute, then you can call it paruv. What's the problem? All the companies say we don't want to call it a non-meat substitute. We want people to think it's meat. So that's in terms of that. But why did he say? What?
It'd be like a confusion.
Exactly. That's the no. That's the thing. That's the thing. The issues of maritime. There's lots of shibboleth. So he wanted to say that if you want to treat it as parav, it has to be clear and it has to be you have to indicate that it's not meat. That it's different to meat. That's not what they want to do. In any event, but the more pressing question, the more important question is it kosher in the first place? Because you're taking the cells that are from within the living animal, that are part of the flesh, and as we've seen, even with the chicken egg, at the earlier part of development, it's still considered flesh. It's still considered part of the meat. So surely, when I'm dealing with a cow and I'm dealing with a cow egg, which is never going to be a parav egg as such, it should be part of the flesh, and it should be considered. We're not going to say ever menachai because it's not a complete limb, but part of basar menachai, part of that, etc. So how do we get around that? If we can get around that, so Rabbi Allah's argument is the following. He wants to say that we have a halachic concept, what's called pirsha ba'alma. Pirsha ba'alma means essentially you have a waste product, you have something this is brought in. There are different examples of this, but something which is not really an inherent part of the animal. There's a discussion that's brought relating to urine of an animal, for example, which is not doesn't sound very appetizing. But again, it's not part of the animal. It's not part of the meat. It's what's called pirsha. It's called essentially a waste product. It's nothing there. And he wanted to argue that obviously it's a little bit more complex than this, and he has sources that he based himself on. But he wanted to argue that these cells, which are microscopic, which are very small, which when you take them out and when you remove them from the animal, they're nothing. They're not meat. They don't look like meat. They don't taste like meat. They're not going to grow into anything because you've taken them out. It's just it's just a waste product. It's nothing, and therefore you're now taking that and you're manipulating that. You can do whatever you want. I'm simplifying a little bit, but that is essentially the argument he wanted to make. Of course, the counter to that, one of the counter arguments to that is that yes, when you take it out and when you remove it from the animal, it's not going to do anything. Now you could say maybe that it's pirsha, but it's at the end of the day, you're dealing with an embryo. You're dealing with something which was in its natural habitat, right? Was going to grow, was going to develop into the animal, into the piece of meat. The fact that you've taken it out doesn't necessarily change that. So you wanted to say that it does. Others wanted to say that it doesn't. What?
Does it taste like meat?
Depends who you ask.
Does it taste like the animal that it can? Does it taste like beef?
At the end of the process, when you take it out, it doesn't taste like anything. It's a microscopic cell. At this point, it doesn't taste like anything.
So then it's something that's going to grow into something else. So it means
no.
Without getting killed here, what would be so bad?
So again, the question is, what?
What would be so bad?
Well, that's the logical extension. If you say that you think that it's just nothing when you take it out and it's completely pure, and this is one of the arguments people threw back at him, was that if you say that it really is nothing, then you take it out and you treat it as nothing and it's just waste. So then who cares if it comes from a cow, if it comes from a pig, if it comes from a human? Are you going to say the same thing? If your argument is, but this has been discussed. If your argument is that it really is nothing, it's just a little cell and it's completely pirsha, that is then it shouldn't really make a difference where it comes from. And there are those who said that. As I say, there's a very strong argument back to this, which is it's not when we talk about pirsha. Normally speaking, take the example of meiraglaim, of urine, for example. That is something which naturally is expelled from the animal. Yeah, nothing is naturally expelled. It only came out because some scientist in a lab somewhere had this crazy idea that you're going to take the cells and grow them into meat, and therefore it's going to. The fact is that if you left it alone and you left it inside the animal, the cell, the embryo, the egg, whatever it is, it's going to grow. It's going to become significant. It's going to turn into a piece of muscle tissue, into an entire animal, whatever it may be, and then. That could be, and then you could say that is significant. So that is one of the main arguments, relating to this point.
Giving it kosherus, how can you pull it perish? By removing it, you're showing that it's kosher.
Yeah.
Okay.
Like in pizza.
Yeah.
When you're giving it kosherus.
That's another argument, which can be made as well. Just to say, and that's maybe deals with something else, because the cell itself is microscopic. you can't see it, right? It's very, very small. We know in halacha there's a klal. You say lo nitna Torah lemalachei hasharei. Generally speaking, something which can't be identified with any of the five senses, has no importance. So there are those who wanted to say, there are those who still want to say it's microscopic. You can't do anything with it. On the other hand, what Marty's suggesting is to say the minute that you take it out, and Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach said this in a different context, but a similar argument, you're taking it out, you're giving it chashivut, you're giving it significance in that sense, and therefore not so simple to say it's bittul, it's nothing, it's not here. It is here. You want it. You're spending millions and billions of dollars in growing it into something. So that is one aspect. We're out of time, but that's essentially one aspect of this discussion, whether it should be kosher or not. As I say, not so straightforward, not so clear cut. More questions than answers at the moment, but watch the space. Rabbi Hanania ben Akasha Omer,